My name is Nikita Boston Fisher, and I'm the Associate Director for the Laidley Center for Business Ethics and Equity. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our second annual Business Ethics Conference. Our theme this year, Ethics in the Aviation Industry, is very exciting and relevant, and I look forward to hearing the dialogue among our panelists. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that McGill University is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which people of the world now gather. I will now introduce and invite the Director of the Laidley Center for Business Ethics and Equity, Dr. Lindsay Holmgren, to share some remarks with you. In addition to directing the center, she is chair of the Academic Integrity Council and an associate professor of strategy and organization at the Desautels Faculty of Management. Dr. Holmgren teaches ethics and rhetoric in the Faculty of Management. Her publications include articles on economic modeling, medical pedagogy and practice, narrative theory, and literary criticism. Her theoretical background underlies Dr. Holmgren's study of narrative in the economic arena, for which she holds an Insight grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Her research is concerned with the relationship between existential phenomena such as COVID-19 and climate change, and the confrontation with finitude that these phenomena have engendered among Canadian university students and recent graduates. Using the narratological methods of linguistic anthropology, Holmgren and her team have interviewed over 400 participants whom they are following over a 10-year period. Dr. Holmgren also sits on the University Advisory for the Use of Generative AI at McGill, emphasizing its ethical implications. Lindsay, we're ready for you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. Thank you, Nikita, for the very kind welcome. I'm delighted to see everyone here today to join us in thinking through some of the ethical challenges facing the aviation industry. Our extraordinary panelists are here today because they care a great deal about the ethical dimensions of their field, and, I would suggest, because they believe that coming together to talk openly and productively about the challenges and provisional solutions in aviation is crucial. Dialogue is too often abandoned in the service of saving time. But an ethical approach to thinking through the kinds of concerns we'll discuss today demands thoughtful, candid, respectful dialogue. As we know only too well, civil discourse as a means of developing and disseminating knowledge is an ethic of its own, and one that we continually see coming under threat. It takes commitment and courage to participate in these conversations, and it takes attentiveness, optimism, and an open mind to listen with a view toward finding solutions and common ground. We're all here today, I believe, because we are all committed to seeking solutions through this kind of productive discourse. That our esteemed speakers and organizations are here today encourages me. It shows me that ethics continues to matter. And despite indicators that the political or social landscape might seem to be decreasingly invested in ethical concerns, there is another growing economy in which we are all participating today. An economy that is deeply and practically concerned with the ethical underpinnings of management in all its forms. An economy concerned with protecting safety, accessibility, and our natural environment, while also attending to the financial requirements of sustaining healthy organizations. The aviation industry, as we all know, has been plagued with a range of ethical challenges. While these kinds of challenges make good headlines, it's our job here to think beyond the headlines and hear from the hardworking practitioners and outstanding academics dedicated to solving the problems that underlie what our contemporary economy so thoroughly depends on globally. It's a tall order, but we look forward to taking a small sliver of it in our hands today and seeing what we can accomplish, both today and after we walk away. Coming up on December 3rd, it's the International Day for Persons with Disabilities. With this in mind, I'm delighted to introduce our first panel on equity and accessibility in all its forms in the aviation industry. While Paola Perez Aleman, Associate Professor in Strategy and Organization, will introduce the panel, I will quickly offer special thanks to one of its members, John Graddick. He has been a tremendous help in making introductions for Nikita and me and helping to bring several of our panelists here today. So thank you to John for that. I won't take much more time, so let's move on. Let's have our open minds and our solution-oriented thinking ready for great discussions, and I will turn it over now to Paola. Thank you, everyone, for being here today.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. So we'll get started with our first panel, and I'm going to call our panelists to come to the front here at the table. So our first panel is on a very relevant topic on ethics, employment equity, and accessibility in the aviation industry. Complex issues in a complex industry when we think about manufacturing, to the service, to the running of airports, to airlines. So this is very complex, and we have people who are working on these different areas. So let me welcome to the front here Vincent Correa, who is a professor of law at McGill University. We have John Graddick, also, who is an aviation management expert and a professor at the McGill School for Continuing Studies. A.J. Jung, who's a professor in the organizational behavior area at McGill University and also our director of equity and inclusion and diversity program at the Desautels Faculty of Management. And Gabor Lucas, director, air passenger rights. So welcome, and we have a great panel that combines academics and people who are working in the industry and also for representation also of consumers. So let's get started. So how many spots do we have? I'll go in the center. You want me to do one? Or you want to sit in the back? The way we've organized this is that each of our panelists is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open for questions. And I will introduce our panelists as each one does their brief intervention. So let me start first with Vincent.
You agreed that John would start.
Oh, you want? Okay. Oh, all right. So you've changed here. Okay. So, okay. All right. So John, we'll start with John then. It's of course with
Thank you.
All of your involvement in organizing this, as Lindsay has already acknowledged. So let me introduce you then. He's a faculty lecturer and academic program coordinator of the Supply Networks and Aviation Management programs of the McGill School of Continuing Studies. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Montreal and a bachelor's of engineering from Carleton University and a master's in business administration from the University of Western Ontario. He has long experience, 2 decades, in management leadership at Air Canada, also in the transportation, working at Canadian Pacific Railway in planning and operational roles. And he has globally diverse knowledge in managing supply chains around the world and transportation organizations. He was one of the founders of the Aviation Management Training Institute, focused on airline management. in different parts of the world, including Asia, Africa, and South America. And he's now in his current role at McGill, where he's focused on issues also of the airline industry. So welcome, John, and thank you. So I'll give you a heads up when you have 5 minutes left. And
you'll probably need a couple of warnings to get me to stop talking. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for showing up at this wonderful session. Lindsay, Nikita, great job in setting it up, and I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for all of your presence this morning, very much appreciated. So what I'm going to talk about really is aviation from a consumer perspective and from a airline executive perspectives. And those two things have what I would call diametrically opposed perspectives in terms of what the expectations are of these two groups of people within aviation. And one of the things that, I've been involved in doing media work along with my friend Gabor for a few years, and we tend to be individuals who have opinions that we'd like to share with the media about what we think is the current state of commercial aviation in Canada. And what has been very apparent in terms of the evolution of aviation in Canada over the last few years is really a growing difference between expectations of the airline managers, the airline executives, and the consumer. And one of the things that's happened in the industry over the last 4 or 5 years since the pandemic really is a feeling by the consumer that they are being basically pushed to the sidelines when it comes to service expectations and recognition of what they consider to be their basic rights as a passenger. And those rights are rights which they've evolved over the last 100 years with aviation in Canada. And there has been somewhat of a laissez-faire attitude, in my opinion, by management about the way in which they treat Canadian passengers. And there are a number of very specific instances when it comes to the ethics of how they operate, how managers at the airline industry operate, and how they in fact meet the expectations of passengers, particularly those passengers that have special needs. And I think that we've all heard stories about disability passengers not being handled properly on board airplanes, and passengers being dragged up and down aisles of airplanes to get off and on airplanes, and not having enough equipment and not having enough staff trained to handle those passengers. And I think, to me, that is gut-wrenching. That is really something that we see as a lack of understanding, probably a lack of respect on the part of the industry to really ensure that all passengers, regardless of their ability to move and to communicate, have the ability to, in fact, expect a high level of service and compassion and empathy. And that is missing, for whatever reason. So I think that we've have a situation now, particularly when it comes to, the evolution of passenger rights. I know Gabor has been, championing passenger rights for decades, really? Close to decades.
2008.
2008, close. So it's really been, a question about why do we have an audience? Why do we have an audience that even listens to Gabor talk or myself talk about passenger rights? And is there anything, is there an expectation that is not being met? And I think I've come to the conclusion that really passenger rights now have become secondary to what is looking at as a profit motive on the part of the airlines and the airports, and I would say all of the players in the aviation industry. That it is much more important for them to basically focus on revenues, on ability to get more profitability, because they all are members of a profit-focused organizations. They all have shareholders which expect some return for their investments in these entities. And I think that one of the things that's happened is that has become the driving force for actions taken by the aviation community in Canada. And I think that one of the things that we have to start to talk about is, how do we raise the profile within the industry about the need to respect passenger rights, how do we, in fact, ensure that airline behavior is such that passenger rights are front and center in their decision-making? Because right now, in my opinion, it is not. So now, how do we do that? And I think that's I have my opinions. I've been making them over the last few months about, regulation, and talking about is there a place for regulation in the way in which customers are being handled by a federally regulated industry. And we have to ask ourselves the question, has deregulation failed us? We deregulated this industry in the early 80s. I was part of Air Canada in that organization dealing with deregulation, and it was very tumultuous, very difficult, but in the end, deregulation stimulated the industry, created lots of jobs, created lots of employment opportunities, lots of markets were being served. However, it has had its failures. And I believe that one of the things that we had to failure to worry about, and one of the things that I've been questioned on consistently over the last couple of years, has been the failure of airlines and the inability of airlines to effectively compete in the marketplace, and that they are being, picked on by either the monopoly, the duopoly, whatever we call the large carriers in Canada. And one of the things that happens is that I consider the behavior of these carriers to be a question of ethics and a question of how they, in fact, do deal with the ways in which they behave in the marketplace. So one of the things that happens when we talk about behavior, it is not looking at the legality of some of their actions that really is of concern to me. We talk about things like collusion. We talk about things like price fixing. We talk about things that have a very specific element of behavior that is, in fact, part of our legal framework in terms of how we, in fact, look at carriers' behavior and how they, in fact, do things that are on the edge of being legal. They are legal, but their behavior is, in fact, detrimental to the way in which we, in fact, look at the service provided from the airlines to the passengers. So I think that there is something to be said on the Competition Bureau's market study, which is currently underway in the aviation industry. We will come up, and I believe the Competition Bureau will in fact make some comment about the behavior, whether it's ethical or whether it's legal. There will be some changes coming up recommended by the Competition Bureau that will in fact try to change some of the ways in which the business is being presented to its customers. Anyway, we'll have this conversation for the next little while. I'll pass the baton back to Paola. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We'll continue with our next panelist, Vincent Correa, who is a professor of the Faculty of Law specializing in aviation law. So we're paying a lot of attention here to regulatory issues, either in how companies relate to regulation, as John has right now highlighted. And Vincent is a professor of law at McGill, and he's previously been professor of public law in France at the University of Poitiers and at the University of Paris-Saclay. He was also a visiting professor at Leiden University, and he has been a lecturer in different universities around the world. He's focusing on the interactions between international air law and national and regional legislations from a multi-level perspective. I think that this gives us a sense, of course, when we're talking about aviation, how complex when we think about these regulatory issues, given the international nature of a lot of these relationships. And he has been doing research on the issues of environmental protection, competition law, liability, and passengers' rights, as well as the liberalization of the air transport sector. So, thank you, Victor, and see you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm extremely happy being here. I'm also extremely happy that we could switch a bit the order, because I knew that I would disagree with John Gradek, because we are here to talk about, but it's also a point, I would say, from a legal perspective here. We, the lawyers, we tend to, evacuate the issue of ethics. And just to share it with you, the ethics, the morals are taken into account when the law is being drafted. But once it's drafted, well, we would use, and I would be a bit cliché for the non-lawyers here because I would use a bit of Latin here, it will be dura lex, sed lex. So once you apply and abide by the rule, then as long as it's legal, it's not questionable. Then you can, on ethical or moral principles, say, okay, the rule should evolve. But the rule in itself, and I would say the enterprises intervening in the field should not be called out for just complying and sticking to the rule. But then as well, and thank you for this very long introduction as well and presentation, because on the issue on passenger protection and as well accessibility, as you mentioned, I was in Europe previously, so I followed the development of air passengers' rights in Europe starting in 1999 and then 2004, and as well the very specific piece of regulation on passengers with reduced mobility that was adopted in 2006. In this respect, I would like to add a couple of elements as well for the discussion, just to say why, as a matter of principle, I will disagree with John. It's also a question of ethical approach for the lawyers. It's the adversarial principle that for us is extremely important. So here we are talking about the practices of the industry, while on the panel, I mean, none of us actually represents the industry. John has been retired for a couple of decades now. Gabor, I know what, sorry, I don't want to be mean. Gabor is representing a portion. Myself, I'm a pure academic. I will never say what they are doing in business. We are academics on this side of the table. But I will try, just as a matter of principle as well, to make maybe the debate a bit more balanced there. So, a couple of points when it comes to passengers' rights. From a regulatory perspective, and I put passengers' rights at large, including all the different issues there that were mentioned before. It is true that the regulatory interventions were necessary at some point because there were some abuses from the sector. The abuses from the sector were the direct results of the liberalization at some point, because what do you want? You want to increase your profit, as John mentioned before. The only thing I would like just to emphasize, and in order to make the debate and the discussion a bit fair, I would say, is that we are talking about an industry having a profit margin, on average, of 2.7%. So it's very low. We are talking about, according to the statistics for last year, about 5 billion passengers transported last year for 2023, in a year that was recovery. And at the same time, because several speakers referred to some press headlines about this or that problem. And we are facing a situation right now that the aviation industry at large, and I'm including as well the manufacturers, that whatever happens, it will make the headline. You have one passenger denied boarding for whatever reason, it will make the headline. Even if it's one in the hundreds of thousands that have been transported that week. You have a problem affecting a Boeing aircraft, it will make the headlines. So sometimes I can understand if it's a design problem and maybe we can enter into the certification issues of the 737 MAX, but I'm afraid it will be basically a conversation that only a few would follow here. But generally speaking, we have a trend right now as well when it comes to the aviation industry, when we talk about the media, of, I would say, sorry for my French accent, and since we are in Canada, sensationalism, well, go with it today, I'm tired this morning, that whatever happens, affecting the aviation industry, it will make the headlines. And then when you speak to journalists, and I will share something with you here because this is something that truly affected me. It was for major media. Well, I will not give more details. But where I spent 1 hour and a half explaining the certification issues, all the legal implications, and so on, for receiving the article 2 weeks later, where just half a sentence was taken to say that, oh, the aircraft manufacturers are just greedy and it's awful. While I was explaining that, no, I'm sorry to say, but this is the example I used and I wanted it to be reflected, I said, well, every time a BMW driver runs over a red light, you don't make a press article. Every time a BMW driver has a flat tire, you don't make a press article. And the aviation industry has this at the moment. And another point I wanted to make as well, and this is now going more to, I would say, my area where I feel more comfortable, the regulatory side here. The regulatory side, and I will use another Latin expression, just to show off, that was used by Cicero back in the days, which is summum ius, summa injuria. What is this? The idea is that the more legal regulations and obligations, the more extreme is the application of the law, the more unjust will be the results. And what is my point here? Is that what happened in this entire air passengers' rights, obligation, legal framework here, what happened in the recent years, and I've seen it in Europe, I see it happening now in Canada, and it will get worse. But what happened is that you had a couple of players on the market not abiding by the rules. I will not name them, but in Europe it was Ryanair, all those low-cost carriers. But have it in mind as well, you had passengers flying for 20 euros, so barely $30, wanting to be treated as if they were paying the full fare. So those players, of course, cutting costs, and they were not the best when it was time to provide best customer service. The issue is that the regulator intervened for everybody. And the regulations that were adopted, while intervening for everybody, made that what was previously done by the airlines, I would say the traditional flag carriers airlines, as a matter of customer satisfaction program, trying to take care of their customers, became an obligation. And I don't know how it is for you, but if it's an obligation, we don't like it. I mean, if my wife obliges me to buy her flowers every 4 days, I will not like it. If I'm free to buy her flowers when I want, I will do it. And what happened in Europe, and what I'm starting to see in basically all the countries that adopted specific passengers' rights regulations, is that what were before normal practices for the vast majority of airlines, but some free riders were trying to escape from them, basically the ones who were not part of IATA actually, then became obligations. And obligations are not pleasant. Enterprises try to do the bare minimum, trying to comply with the law. And the case law, the judges, became more and more tough on the airlines. Here, it's really the European experience became more and more tough on the airlines, and it generated even more resistance on the airline side, but by saying, okay, but we are doing our best. I will just take one example, and I'm sure that Gabo will address it afterwards. You take the European experience, delays. So you have an airline having delays. Well, the regulations, the European regulation in the first place, didn't provide for monetary compensation in case of delays. Why? Because you're an enterprise. You fly. Normally, it's not, well, when I'm late, it's not because I like being late. When the airline is being late, it's not because they like being late. It costs a lot of money. But they still carry the passengers. They still burn the fuel, and they still pay their crew. And at some point, for a reason, and in a case back in 2010, it was interpreted, but it's a bit unfair not to give compensation for passengers having long delays if you give it for passengers having cancelled flight, which is true. Because in that case, it was also some abuses from the airlines that were saying, oh no, it's not cancelled, it's just delayed. So it's both, it's a vicious cycle there. I'm just trying to be extremely fair. But what happened regarding this is that at some point you have a situation where if an airline has a delay of more than 3 hours, here I'm just taking the European example not to make so many enemies in the room, have 3 hours of delay, they will carry the passenger, burn the fuel, pay the crew, bring the passengers to their final destination, and on top, they will have to pay 250, 400, or 600 euros per passenger. Well, if I were manager there, I would say, well, you know what, we just stop. we're just out of business because we have 2.7% of profitability margin. So what I'm trying to explain here with this system is that sometimes there are some decisions as well from the regulatory side that are perfectly, and this will be the very last point before finishing here, some decisions that are perfectly valid when you take one particular case. And this is also a problem from the legal perspective, that you will have a judge looking at the situation and saying, oh yeah, but in that situation, it's true that it's unfair. I'm referring here to the case I had in mind. Yes, 48 hours of delay compared to persons having a cancellation and reaching their final destination way earlier. Yes, it would be unfair. But what judges very often forget is the multiplying factor, is that you will decide on a case because you have in front of you a poor passenger affected, but then you have to multiply it by the hundreds of thousands of passengers. And this is an increased cost on the industry. And the very, actually no, I lied. Never trust me on this, but the very last point as well, because this comes to my mind. From the European experience, the fight, the debate between customers, airlines, the industry, and so on, have been on those passengers' rights regulation, on delays, denied boarding, cancellation, and so on. But there is a 2006 regulation on the rights of passengers with reduced mobility, which is coordinating the efforts between the airports, the airlines, and to my knowledge, there have been no real debate, no real legal fights regarding this. Neither the airports or the airlines fought about saying, we don't want to comply with this or that. So on this respect, we cannot accuse the industry, at least for the reduced mobility, for the countries having this kind of regulations, of not being ethical. Of course, I'm sure that Gabor will find some example of a passenger being denied boarding because the wheelchair could not fit in. But then you have to take in mind that aviation is a heavily regulated industry. You have safety, you have security requirements, and those also have been taken into account. So it's way more difficult than taking one little case, making the headlines, then going to the political side and say, oh, change the rules, adopt more regulation, because as a lawyer, I would tell you, we sometimes don't need more regulation.
All right. Thank you, Vincent, for underlining that the aviation industry is one of the most heavily regulated industries. I think, as an example, whether it's internationally, regionally, and at the national level. And we'll continue the conversation. Actually, we'll move to Gabor, as these three panelists are heavily focused on the aviation industry and the regulatory issues. And so we'll go to AJ last, because she's taking a broader perspective on issues of inclusion and diversity. So let me introduce Gabor. You've already been mentioned several times here in this conversation. He is the director of Air Passenger Rights. So very rightly, right, that you have been pointed to several times. And Gabor Lucas has a PhD in mathematics from York University. And he had different postdoctoral fellowships in Germany at the University of Bremen, as well as at Halsey University. And after serving as assistant professor at the University of Manitoba and at Dalhousie, then he moved his career to be an advocate for passenger rights in Canada. And he has been leading many successful complaints with the Canadian Transportation Agency, of course, a very important regulator, and particularly looking at how to improve the conditions for carrying and offering better protection to passengers. Because of his advocacy and work for passengers' rights, he has received many awards from the Consumers Association of Canada. He received the Order of Merit for dealing with issues of overbooking with Air Canada. He also, recently in November, the Public Interest Advocacy Center awarded him the Herrigal Award for Transportation in Competition to Connect Communities. And he has been in many cases in courts in Canada, in federal courts of appeals and the Supreme Court of Canada, also on cases related to air passenger rights, which he has successfully challenged in relation to the issues of transparency and reasonableness and the interests of consumers. So definitely, certainly a very active and successful advocate for passengers' rights. So Gabor, it's all yours, and I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank the organizers for putting on this wonderful conference and for commencing a very important task of discussion, because I don't think anywhere else outside academia it would be possible to have this discussion, and it's wonderful to have John next to me, and we're smiling at him because indeed probably in those times he was still grinding his teeth when I was fighting Air Canada. So today I would like to more focus on a narrower topic. I will probably debate, comment on other comment, but in our quite politically polarized and divided Canada, people often debate whether there is or isn't systemic racism in Canada. And in my mind, both sides are missing an important mark. On the one hand, Canada is generally a tolerant and welcoming country. It rejects most Canadians would reject racism. But on the other hand, Canadian society undoubtedly has some pockets infected with racism. And in my advocacy for passengers, I observed racism and similar human rights violations in two areas. One is in the immigration system, IRCC, CBSA, and other is the airline industry. And on the former, on immigration, you may want to look up my paper co-authored with Simon Wallows, Ben Perman, and Sean Riag on Canada's extraterritorial migrant interdiction program. But today I would like to tell you about the latter, and more precisely about how airlines may get away with human rights violations that occur on board flights or before, around the time of boarding. I would like to start with an example of David and Ian, who are members of protected minorities. You pick your favorite one, who hold confirmed bookings on flights from Montreal to London via Toronto. They are booked on the same Montreal-Toronto flight and happen to be even seated on their boarding passes next to each other. The agent gate at the Montreal airport refuses to let David and Ian board. She even hurls and insulted both of them to the effect that people with their characteristics should not even be flying. David and Ian know that the way they were treated was wrong, and they are confident that the airline owes them compensation under the Canadian Human Rights Act. It is only when David and Ian see Fiona, the feisty human rights lawyer, that they learn that David, who was flying domestically to London, Ontario, may get compensation, while Ian, who was flying internationally to London, England, may be facing an uphill battle. So how is it possible that two people who experienced the same type of discrimination, same type of issue, even would be seated next to each other on the same plane, yet have so different rights? And the answer relates to the Montreal Convention, and hopefully I don't need to hear too many people what Montreal Convention is. It has a force of law in Canada thanks to the Carriage by Air Act, and it governs airlines' liability to passengers who travel internationally for baggage delay, damage, loss, and passenger delay, and for accidental injury and death of passengers. The Montreal Convention also contains an exclusivity provision, Article 29, that has often been interpreted by the courts as limiting passengers' remedies against airlines to those set out in the Montreal Convention, and prohibiting recourse to domestic law, to state law. And the rationale being is that they want to create uniformity. The laws, the rules for the airlines operating internationally should be the same among all signatory states. And so the logic goes on to say, since the Montreal Convention does not provide damages for human rights violations, courts have repeatedly held, in my view, incorrectly, that the Montreal Convention precludes awarding monetary damages for human rights violations that occurred on board international flights. Of course, you wonder what remedies may be available when you have a racist flight attendant, but not the airline itself being racist, just one person. You cannot send all flight attendants to a re-education camp just because of one of them. The examples that I mentioned so far, however, are not as theoretical or not abstract as it may appear. And I would like to also bring some spotlight on existing court cases that occurred and are affecting human rights to this date on board flights. The first one is George and Judy King, who were an African-American couple who held confirmed tickets for a flight from Miami to Grand Bahamas. Their flight was overbooked, and the Kings were bumped from that flight. And the Kings believed that they were selected to be bumped because of their race and their color. But in the US, the Kings' lawsuit was thrown out. They sued for discrimination. It was thrown out because it was held that their lawsuit was barred by the exclusivity principle of the Montreal Convention. Additional information, it was Justice Sotomayor on the court, from the Court of Appeal at the time, who was on that ruling. Another case, speaking of disabilities, Christopher Stott in the UK. He was a person with disabilities, paralyzed from the shoulder down, and permanent wheelchair user who depended on his wife to help him eat, change his sitting position, and even manage his incontinence while traveling. Mr. Stott was booked on a round trip from UK to Zante, Greece, and then back. He advised the airline, Thomas Cook, about his disability and need for accommodation, as he should. And on the way back, on the way out, things were okay. But on the way back, somehow, he was not provided with accommodation as required by UK law and was subject to humiliating treatment due to his disability. And there was no safety issue involved there. So there was no issue with the wheelchair size. And the UK Supreme Court held that the Montreal Convention's exclusivity principle precludes an award of damages to Mr. Stott that he would normally be entitled to under the UK law because the human rights violations occurred on board an international flight. These, however, are not only Canadian cases. When we look at Michael and Linda Thibaudot, who were passengers on an Air Canada flight where they were not provided services in French, contrary to the Official Languages Act, we see that the problem appears also in Canada. There's a Thibaudot case. They would have clearly been entitled to monetary compensation had they been flying domestically within Canada, but not when they were flying internationally. And the majority of the Supreme Court of Canada endorsed King and Stott and held that insofar as international travel is concerned, the Montreal Convention barred monetary damages even for violations of quasi-constitutional rights, such as those set out in the Official Languages Act. Justice Abella and Justice Wagner dissented and held, in my view correctly, that the Montreal Convention's exclusivity source of remedies applies only to issues which are within the scope of the convention, baggage and passenger issues that are addressed within it, but doesn't bar claims for human rights issues. And perhaps the most important quote from that decision goes as follows: just as Parliament is not presumed to legislate in breach of a treaty, it should not be presumed to implement treaties to extinguish fundamental rights protected by domestic legislation. This brings us now 10 years later to the recent IATA decision by the Supreme Court, because the Montreal Convention was being used as a way to challenge Canada's air passenger protection regulations, arguing that because the APPR does not require proof of damages, it's just a standardized compensation, therefore it was precluded by the exclusivity principle. And the Supreme Court of Canada unanimously held that the Montreal Convention's exclusivity principle, endorsed in Thibaudot, applied only to claims for damages, but APPR standardized compensation was in the nature of a debt, not damages. Problem solved, seemingly. But the IATA decision, although it's a decisive victory for consumers on the compensation aspect, it still muddied the water further when it comes to human rights. Because it was endorsing Thibaudot to some degree, but then also backpedaling on it, saying Article 29 should be understood as precluding actions for damages that share the characteristics of judicial proceedings in courts of law and that seek individualized compensation for death or bodily injury, damage or loss of baggage and cargo, and for delayed international carriage. So after all, this kind of suggests, well, maybe you can seek damages still under human rights, but it doesn't settle the law and it remains outstanding. The recent decision from the Federal Court of Appeal, however, is also bad news when it comes to human rights. Abdallah Zogby was a Halifax taxi driver, originally from Lebanon. He has been a Canadian citizen for many decades. And after a flight attendant overheard him speaking Arabic on the phone, he was removed from an international flight from Halifax to London, UK. He was en route to visit his ailing father. The Canadian Human Rights Commission, bless their little hearts, dismissed Mr. Zogby's human rights complaint about racial ethnic discrimination on the sole basis of the Montreal Convention, of the exclusivity principle. So essentially, if you're on board a flight, forget about it. We're not going to touch it. Ultimately, while Mr. Zogby successfully sought judicial review of the decision, and the matter was referred back to the Human Rights Commission to deal with some charter issues, it was a Pyrrhic victory, because the Federal Court of Appeal held that Article 29 of the Montreal Convention, the exclusivity principle, was barring him from recovering monetary damages. So when it was a one flight attendant or a few people involved in this, what kind of remedy may exist to a person in Mr. Zogby's position? Nothing. He just has to lump it. Take it like a chump that he's being thrown off a flight because of his nationality, because of his speaking Arabic, because of his ethnicity. So I'm concerned that this decision from the Federal Court of Appeal has closed the door and nailed it shut for monetary claims for human rights violations occurring on board international flights, whether it is racism, discrimination for gender identity, or a failure to accommodate disabilities. And this is also a concern because Canada may well be in the breach of its obligations under Article 6 of the International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which guarantees a right to an effective remedy against any act of racial discrimination. So it has to be, some effective remedy has to be, and if you cannot provide money, well, what is the effective remedy then to Mr. Zogby? In many cases, indeed, we're not talking about systemic discrimination that the airline has secret Ku Klux Klan membership. They're business people, decent human beings who have nothing to do with racism from a management perspective. It is just individual people who engage in discrimination, and something has to be done to stop that. So the good news is that Mr. Zogby is currently seeking leave to appeal. He's asking the Supreme Court of Canada to hear his case and decide whether claims for human rights damages are barred by the Montreal Convention. And while I hope that we don't have to wait for too long to get some guidance from the Supreme Court of Canada on this point, this also underscores the need for lawmakers to step in, because unlike the issue of compensation, there is probably a quite big consensus that people should not be discriminated on board of international flights. So it should not be a controversial topic that Montreal Convention should not be precluding or preempting human rights. Because after all, in 2024, international flights should not be a human right-free zone. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabor. One of the things that stands out for me in this in your presentation is that even when you have regulation that protects the rights, there is a whole issue of how it's implemented, how it's enacted in organizations. And I'm reminding of a term that's called the street-level bureaucrat. In other words, those that are facing the customer, right? And so this is certainly something that's being highlighted here. So I think thank you, Gabor. And it's a nice segue also to AJ Jun's presentation that is going to be looking more broadly at organizations and issues of inclusion and equity. AJ is Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Desautels Faculty of Management here at McGill. And she's also the director of our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion program. She has a PhD in management from INSEAD, and she was previously a professor at Imperial College London before joining McGill. And her focus is broader than on the aviation industry. She's looking at the issues of impact, diversity, and inequality in organizations more broadly. And I think one of the aspects of her study looks at the airline among others, right? So it's not exclusively there. And she's looking at corporate leadership issues, at teams, at boards of directors, and at elite workers, and how interventions actually foster inclusivity for marginalized groups in companies. So thank you, AJ, and so it's your turn now.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm HJ Hee-jung. It's actually quite fascinating to sitting here at the table with Vincent, Gabor, and John, learning about aviation industry, what kind of, hot topics and important topics we are trying to tackle. Then, to be very honest, I have to be very honest. I am director of equity, so I'm going to be very, very honest. I prepared my slide. I thought it was going to be my presentation somehow. So until the moment that I actually get here, I was actually changing my slide and make it really nice. Can I put the Air Canada logo in perfectly and kind of thing? But I learned that actually this is going to be a beautiful panel discussion this way, which is perfect. While we are talking and we're waiting, actually I learned something quite new that I never really thought about it, that I've been working more for the organization side and equity within the organizations. Then now I'm learning more about the consumers, and I think it's quite closely related that I can actually see. I mean, I'm very waiting for the our discussion after this. But for example, the John is how we actually can make our company ready to accommodate diverse clients and diverse passengers. It can be somebody from the very minor religions, can be someone who has a disability or different level, and or different racial minorities or genders, and small children and very old passenger too, right? So how we can accommodate? Do we need a regulation? Or can we actually make all the regulation for every single different groups? It's quite challenging thing. One thing I can imagine that how I can associate to my research and my work is probably it's about having more diverse the organizational member who truly understand, who can actually pass my knowledge and what I feel, what I genuinely knows to my colleague, and actually share and accommodate those clients and those passengers. I'm not saying that we don't need a regulation. There is a certain regulation, and there is no regulation. I'm not actually saying that. But even within regulation, the companies can decouple and or make it superficial. So actually, even passengers or clients or consumers can feel that whether this regulation and these actions are superficial or this is really genuinely adopted. So in my view is that having those diverse workforces in different occupation within even organization is really important. That's what I'm working on too, for the various industry. A few days ago, and so I started to look into aviation industry more closely and what kind of workforces they have. And what I found, and before that, actually I just realized that I was traveling with 25 different airlines for the last 10 years. So it's quite an experience. Unfortunately, I never really felt that I am mistreated or I treated unfairly, except one airline. I'm not going to name it, but it's one airline from my own country. That is because I speak English, and because of the language barriers and etc., then they want me to move somewhere for the other one. But again, that compared to others incidents, this is not the different thing. One thing I wanted to say is a few days ago, so I went to Air Canada website. So I saw that there are some couple of people from Air Canada here, and it's actually, you don't have to be nervous. It's a good news. So I went to their DEI webpage, so diversity, equity, and inclusions, and I saw their action plan. And second bullet point, because I actually put in the slides, but now I'm going to read it. Attract diverse talent by building partnerships with external organizations and by participating in diverse career fairs and events. And with the collaboration with the internal talent acquisition team. So this is their action plan, and our action plan. And I was very impressed by two factors. Number one is, in that sentence, and actually I'm not working for Air Canada, so I can't really truly see what kind of strategy they are doing in behind that. But I can feel that a lot of equity goals and inclusion goal that we've been pursuing was moving somehow from social goal and social importance that actually is moving to the corporate goals. That airlines are aware that this is quite important, not because we are a good airline or we're good people, but this is really truly helpful for the corporate. So I can feel that. And actually, in the data showing, the most recent data showing that the company who has a diverse workforces normally generate 30% more revenue and then 70% more market share for the future niche markets. And so I guess the airlines are aware that this is quite important. And what I understood is that I think that this Air Canada, at least Air Canada, because that's what I studied now, Air Canada is aware that acquiring those talents are quite challenging. That they were not saying that we are going to have diverse workforces, but they specify what we are going to do, the building partnerships with the external organizations and participating in diverse career fairs and events. What they're showing is that we are not going to post a job and saying that we are looking for certain workforces, but what they're saying is that we are going to somebody and then acquiring really actively, right? So that's something that I was thinking a little bit, it's not silver lining. I felt great about the approach that they are taking now. Because I believe that now in at least aviation industries, that they believe that acquiring diverse forces are really important, but it's quite challenging, so they are developing the different channels. So I wanted to share the one of very short time as my research. And let's take it as an intermission before we are jumping into the big conversation about the regulations and the human right. When I applied for job market, when I applied for the PhD program, I figured out that I applied for 18 universities for my PhD. That's a lot. And then it was 15, 16 years ago, and it was actually, no, it's actually more than, I'm sorry, it was almost 10 years ago. And you had to pay $100 US dollars per application. So I can't really go more than 18 because of my financial restraints, but if I had it, I think I could just continue. And then my strategy was applying for the top school to the really low rank school, because I was worried that non-native speaker studying Korea, and then maybe although my GRE score, GMAT score was top 2%, but I was unsure. And that was my strategy. And then when I get into INSEAD, and then I was talking to my colleague, and then including, you know, friends from France and friends from the Western Europe and from the States and the Canada, and then they said they apply max 3 schools. And then you know what is the biggest difference? Our GRE score, our TOEFL, GPA, my essay, nothing. It's a confidence. I doubted that whether this great school will accept me. They were sure at least one of 3 schools will tag me. And for me, the chance is going to be very slim in my mind, even though I am well qualified, and then I had to increase my chance to get in. The strategy is doing all the efforts and submitting everything. Whenever any offer comes in, I sign. And we found this happen in the elite job seekers within Canada. So I actually had a beautiful chart, but if I can actually tell you, the racial minority job seekers versus white job seekers, and then they are from the same university, same degree, similar GPA, similar workforce, they actually apply double more jobs. And the winner who comes first, and they guess who is coming the first. The companies with low rankers, they come first to actually ask them to sign because they are overqualified, and they come and they sign. The time that they got offer and then the time that actually they sign takes only 24 hours. On the other hand, the white job seekers, they took a week or 2 weeks to negotiate or waiting for the better job is coming. So in our research, that what we did is that we are actually giving a little nudge to boost the confidence for the job seekers, and that they can wait and they can aim high. And then by doing so, the acceptance rate for the top companies, like top leaders in aviation, for example, and it was 15% for the racial minority, and then it improved to around 35%. So what I wanted to say is that the companies are spending so much money and then try to require diverse workforces, but applicants are not coming to you. That's a fundamental problem. You're spending so much money, we do a lot of tactics, but diverse workforces are not coming to you because they don't believe yet that there is some genuine thing whether I'm going to be welcomed. So one of a couple of things the company can actually think of is that in the meantime, we are actually changing our culture and making more equal, a more inclusive society and organizations. What kind of nudges we have to actually give to the workforces we can actually bring, who can address those important issues? And how we can actually showing that our acceptance and acceptiveness. And then one is again about like Air Canada's action plan and building a lot of pipelines and then the channel to go to them and then speak and then nudging them to come to us. And without those more granular and more efforts actually, that thing that it's really difficult to get in those workforces and then hence to solve a lot of issues facing the different types of passengers. I'm very happy to share more studies about this with everybody later, but I think that I'm going to wrap up here and then ready for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our panelists. I must say that this has been really insightful discussion. I've actually done research on the aerospace industry in a whole different side of it, which has to do with innovation. Looking at R&D and the development of new aircraft. And what was interesting, just to connect here, is that I learned that the heavy regulation related to safety that influences how innovation is conducted in the aerospace industry. And it was interesting to see how Canadian regulatory agencies, European regulatory agencies, their aviation regulatory agencies, and the US, let's say as the three, right, the FAA also as being, of course, three major regulatory agencies, worked with the companies, the aerospace companies, and in fact we had a Canadian example here in aerospace was they designed a new aircraft, a very innovative aircraft, and we could say that one of the things that went hand in hand with innovation was the safety element as a crucial aspect of developing commercial aircraft. I'm talking about commercial aircraft, not military aircraft. But so we can see that safety, making sure that these aircraft did not fall down, right, was crucial then to move the industry forward. And in many components of this industry, right, that are associated with making an aircraft. So I think, for me anyway, I was trying to understand the processes of R&D in this interface, and it actually made the industry hard to imitate by others because of all these processes that focus on safety and how this was interwoven with every aspect of the design process in the R&D. So for me, that is the perspective that I have of how intertwined they are. And so the possibilities then to see all these engineers and managers highly focused on this safety angle at every aspect that they would change to improve a component in a new aircraft design. So I think we have examples that show us that the industry moves ahead, the innovation moves ahead when we put at the center aspects that might seem to be at the opposite, or where we feel that profitability and ethics, good ethics, let's say, are opposed. But we can see that it actually, in practice, we have examples. And in a sense, this is where here we have some input about the regulatory aspect, but we also have some examples of how, even when you have regulation, the implementation dimension is super difficult. where people are the ones who are doing this, right? People who are managing, engineers, employees, all of these who are implementing whatever new regulation is. So I just would like to kick off our questions, as I'm sure you have many questions, but for me, I would like to see that we have seen here that there is a heterogeneity. The, geographical, regional, we have different dimensions here, the consumer interface aspect, inside each of these organizations that are working on in the industry. So what I would like us to think about is where have we seen some major progress in this area, and what characterizes it when we actually make progress in these areas? Because I can see when I'm, like I tell you, from the innovation and R&D side, how relevant it is to keep safety at the center as you are innovating. And it had led to breaking new grounds and improvements that have made it very competitive from that side. So my question to you is, as we continue this discussion, is where have we seen inroads? Because there's definitely been advances on the regulatory side, despite these examples that you're mentioning, where we have still a lot more to go. But can we put out there some examples so that we can also learn from that?
Well, I'm somewhat, I guess I have some difficulty with the premise of your question, to be honest, because...
Well, the question here is to move forward on these ethical issues in the industry, what works to make it work well
I think
for accessibility, for equity, for inclusion? Can we have an example when we say this is important for it to move forward?
And you see that where I'm having some difficulty with the whole framing of the question is that, to my mind, corporations are single-purpose machines from how they function. They're machine to optimize profits. It doesn't mean that they cannot be used for ethical purposes. Just like you can use a knife to cut bread and feed people or to kill someone. But there's nothing inherently ethical or unethical in a corporation. It's just a question of what kind of inputs we are providing to a corporation, to a business industry, is going to affect it, whether it's going to be ethical or unethical. Let's also bear in mind ethics is a very relative notion. Someone believes that poor people should all die. Other people believe that we need to help poor people. This is an axiomatic question that, of course, we're going to have our views of people who espouse one kind of view over the other. But again, it's not a law of nature. So if we as a society want to ensure that corporations behave in what we believe to be ethical, what we believe to be desirable. I think desirable is maybe a better, more neutral way of putting it. That's where regulation comes into place, because what regulation does, if regulation is done well, is aligning profitability with desirable behavior. When we see problems that happen in the industry, when we see what people believe unethical behavior, that is happening in many cases, and you can actually prove it with economic calculations, because disobeying the law, acting unethically, is more profitable than acting ethically. And as a machine which is built to maximize profits, they are going to select the course of action which brings the most profit, even if it means, like in Jonathan Swift's example, selling babies for food. I'm sure you're familiar with the literary reference from, I think it's called in English, the modest suggestion. So if we want airlines to, or any other industry to behave ethically, then there have to be some financial consequences that hit the bottom line, that result in significant loss of profit if they don't act the way that we expect them to as a society. Then it will be a profitability calculation. What is going to bring more profit? To let people with disabilities suffer, or to accommodate them? And then all of a sudden it will not depend on individual values, but whoever, even if you put an AI in place of a human to decide what the policy will be, the AI will be able to calculate to you in a completely rational, valueless logic that accommodation of disability is what is going to bring the most profit to the company. So,
All right, thank you.
If I may, just for the pleasure of disagreeing, of course, and because we are here to exchange ideas. Just a general comment as well, because you linked it with design, safety, and everything. I want to say that some issues of accessibility are already being taken into account. If you look at the design of newer model of aircraft as well, the doors are wider in order to accommodate wheelchairs, because in the past it was an issue, because I was told by some engineers, I never understood why, but it was way more difficult to make bigger doors, maybe for the resistance of the airframe, I guess so, but they do it in order to accommodate that kind of well, but that's very fundamental necessity here. But then, just to make a couple of comments as well, because you were mentioning that you had a slide on, and you mentioned about Air Canada, and just to be entirely honest, maybe they will hate me because I saw some people from Air Canada in the room. Be nice. Can you please stand up? Please, no, please, just to make the point as well. It will be a... It just to show, because the point of Gabor was to say no, airlines or industries are just here to make profitability, they are just focused on. And while you made your point regarding the website that Air Canada is putting in place, for me it was striking to see, well, here we have young people, we have different genders, we have different origins, and this is going beyond just putting it on paper in order to attract whatever funding or to attract more customers. Then, regarding your question about what would be the way forward, and here it will allow me to again disagree with Gabor. I'm sorry, but
academics, it's okay.
Yeah, that's the well, and no. And regarding the legal aspects here, there are some things I wanted just to highlight, because I don't want people to leave the room as well having some confused ideas regarding some legal aspects that you mentioned. And maybe they don't, well, maybe you... I will focus on some elements here. You were addressing the issue about constitutional rights and elements. I am the first one to say human rights, the fact that constitutional rights are not being taken into account when applying the...
Quasi-constitutional. It is a far broader notion.
Whatever. Regarding this point here, just a couple of elements that maybe they don't teach at the mathematical faculty here, is that what do we want? We want an international convention. You refer to the International Convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. I agree. We want it to be applied. We have the Montreal Convention. I agree it's not perfect. But if you advocate for the circumvention of an international convention in order to apply quasi-constitutional rights at national level, you are violating one basic principle of international law, which is the so-called pacta sunt servanda, that you respect the convention. So you can advocate to say that the convention is not good. I would agree. You can advocate for the fact that the convention is not complete or does not address. And I think this is something we should do as well with ICAO. But to say, okay, nowadays the Montreal Convention 1999 maybe should be updated. But this entire trend that we see with the passengers' rights, and in Europe, the national courts, European court, here as well with the city and some decisions, that is to say, okay, you know what? The result will be unfair. So we will circumvent the content of the convention in order to go to what will be ethical, what would be moral in this particular situation is unethical for the entire legal structure, because if you agree to circumvent the Montreal Convention, because it's not perfect, then you will have another case, another lawyer that will come and say, you know what, this international convention on the elimination of racial discrimination, I don't like it for this or that reason, because on national level I have other grounds, and you will circumvent it. So then what do you have? You have no international law, so then it's useless to draft international conventions. And this is something that is a question of hierarchy of norms, of what do we want, and I am not saying that your combat, your fight here is not, but it's also to know where to put it, I would say, regarding the advocacy. Because the exclusivity principle, but why did we make it? Because we want uniformity. The convention is not good. I totally agree. There are a lot of things that are not included there. But circumventing it means that then it's useless to talk about the Paris Convention on Climate, the Kyoto Protocol, and so on and so forth. Because then you will say, yeah, but on quasi-constitutional grounds, I can circumvent. The very last thing, in order to go towards your point, is that as well, there are several cases where I would say, and if I were advising some enterprises, and I'm going beyond the airlines there, we just tell them, you know what, why are you going to court? So there are some cases where I would have said, well, it's maybe better to pay, to accommodate, you should have behaved in such a way in the first place. But there is another element, and it's referring to what you mentioned before as well, and John alluded to it as well before. And it was implicit in the discussion previously. We are talking here about heavily regulated industry, you were mentioning cases that had to go to Supreme Court. The problem is, then it's a management and it's beyond my area of expertise, but when you have some problems where they come at judges who have no clue, that they have to go to Supreme Court and they have no clue, they hire legal experts who have no clue, sometimes how can you expect the gate agent to know what will be the right decision? How can you expect the flight attendant to know what would be the right decision? And for me as well, it's a question of, I would say, fairness in general, in order not to take those moments where there is a failure in the system to throw away the entire industry by saying, well, it's just driven by profit. Because I'm sorry, but really to finish, and I know that it's just to give you more arguments to disagree, but to finish, this is something that you mentioned before as well in your presentation, is that aviation is one of the most diverse. And if you take the multinational cruise, it's part of the business, it's part of the culture as well. But it's also at the way the rules are being drafted. If you look at ICAO, it's really the international cooperation there. And there are some cases that dating back from the 70s that the first advancements when it comes to equality between men and women were made regarding the aviation industry. Because before it was not so fair. But just the advancements were made there.
All right, thank you. So, AJ and John, would you like to add anything more to this question?
Let's make John to speak. He has many things to.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying this. I really enjoy the arguments going on. Of course, I'm not the legal expert here. I leave it to Vincent to kind of give me the right path to take. But I think one of the things that comes to mind, and I will let you question a good friend of mine later on today about Boeing and the Boeing story, and talk about ethics and talk about the way in which safety, and we've talked about safety and how important safety is to aviation. I was brought up in an aviation industry where safety was never an issue, that we trusted the aviators to build airplanes that would basically not fall from the sky. And I think that, for the most part, we are basically very, very privileged to have constructors, builders of airplanes, ensure that airplanes do not fall out of the sky on a regular basis. But when they do, and we have media and we have everybody's attention focused on, the way in which those airplanes are being built, and the question about behavior, the question about ethics, the question about how organizations are in fact making decisions about how do you build an airplane. I think, it is a case study for me that the Boeing evolution over the years since their acquisition or the merger with McDonnell Douglas, that really changed the Boeing culture, changed the Boeing perspective. And I'll let Duff talk about it later on this afternoon if he wants to, but it really was a way in which safety now took a back seat to the way in which the manufacturer was building the airplane. Yes, they had regulators that were looking at the way the airplanes were being built, but the ethics associated with the quality and the way in which we were engineering these airplanes, to me, at this point in time, are called into question. of how do you behave as a business, building these airplanes, and yet taking shortcuts and taking practices that were tried and true, and at a certain point in time were put aside for the sake of corporate performance. And I think, you know, if there's a question we have to ask that's in my mind, that's still sitting in the back of my mind about ethics and about how we in fact look at, you know, the ethics within the aviation industry. Yes, we have issues associated with our friends in terms of the legal side of it, and I know my friends at the CTA are facing 80,000 complaints or appeals for APPR adjudication. That is not acceptable. That is something that we've kind of lost control of, that we've created expectations about what should be something to be appealable. The ethics of that process don't make any sense to me. To have 80,000 Canadians sitting there waiting and having to deal with bureaucracy to get their appealings heard, to me, you know, and I'm going to be a little bit of a heretic here today, but the time has come for us to scrap the APPRs. We don't need the APPRs. We need basically a behavioral change by the industry in terms of how you deal with passenger service and how you deal with passenger organizations. The APPRs are a construct that we took out of the European Union, thank you, in 2004. I'm asked the question, why haven't our friends south of the border, well, they're still our friends until January 6th, but yeah, how is it that our friends south of the border don't have their own set of APPRs? What have they used to, in fact, look at behavioral change on the part of the industry? It's a much more fine-oriented. So I fined Southwest Airlines $140 million for misbehaving when it comes to handling passengers as a result of an airline's lack of foresight in management systems. That paid attention. The industry paid attention. It changed the behavior of the industry. We, in Canada, have fines that we can, in fact, put into the marketplace by the CTA of $250,000 per incident. What have we had in terms of fines issued by the CTA for misbehavior by the airlines? A spattering of $250 of fines. To me, the regulators basically, and the oversight is not really there to change the behavior of the industry. And I think that's something that we should be looking at.
Thank you. John, AJ, did you want to add something here? And after AJ, we're open for questions. I'm looking at the time here since we have the other panel.
Mine is really quick. Number one is why I do not know all the details about the regulation around the aviation industry, that these regulation is quite simple. One is that when you can't really rely on human decisions and their knowledge, and it's really difficult to control, then there is kind of force that please follow this in the meantime. Now, whether the regulation always works, not works, it's depending on, so it's really difficult to say. One thing I want to say is that there is a study and statistic, and in manufacturing industry, for example, when the company's profit goes down and the performance, indicators are not really great, and then they start to cut all the ethics strategy or EDI strategies, other look good strategies, and then by believing that this is kind of secondary course, so this kind of tennis course or swimming course, when your math and English suffers, then you don't spend your money to there. And surprisingly, the result is that by cutting those things, that actually the company doesn't improve their profits or revenues, and it doesn't actually correct any of their performances. So what I wanted to ask, and then here in the audience, is whether that is the regulation and putting that as a regulation, or making the airlines to focus on those matters actually really hurts the company, or it can actually improve the company's profit or overall growth in other matters, or it is one very good way of the risk management. And without knowing that, just seeing about regulation per se is quite tricky and dangerous conversation, that without knowing what would happen, whether did any companies and any regulations, Unity was actually seeing the data, what happened in different index of the performance, how did it improve and actually hurt, and then how we can actually make a more granular, the nuanced regulation. So I think that discussion has to be really companion, otherwise it's too early to conclude, in my view. Yeah.
Thank you to our panelists. And I would like to open to questions from you, looking at the time. So we have about 10-15 minutes. So we want to make sure that, I'm sure from this discussion, I mean, I just posed one question and you see how it sparked all of these different perspectives. So I'm sure there are lots of questions emerging from you. So please, how would you like to, people can go to, yes, you want people to go to the microphone? Yes, please, because they're recording. So if you could please go to the microphone. Thank you.
Okay, all right. And thank you for all the panelists today for the great deliberations. My name is Mi, and I'm from the McGill Institute of Air and Space Law. And there's a lot of discussion about profit versus ethical issues. And lately, we've seen a lot of actions behind the scenes, even behind the facade of airline itself, that goes against the passengers' rights, and if not the public's, the rights of the passengers, that is the behaviors of the shareholders and the investors. And also there's an ongoing issue between investor activism. If you look at the issue behind the Southwest Airlines lately, they went through a radical change in terms of their boarding processes and their other policies. The good news is they haven't changed their baggage policy yet, but we can expect that to come very shortly if the number doesn't add up. What do you think is the right balance between the rising issue of shareholders' right and investor activism and the ethical issues? Because I think this will have a stronger effect to me versus just the airline itself trying to go around the regulations and the conventions. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. The industry is changing. There's no doubt about it that, what is activism and what is change, and how do shareholders have a voice in the way in which an airline is being run. So there is a lot more attention being paid today than, let's say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, in terms of activism and the results of that activism in terms of the behavior of the airlines. So it's not going to go away. It is going to be more and more prevalent. And the question is going to be one of how much attention the airlines do pay to activism. And yes, Southwest, suffered the consequences of an activist shareholder. The question now is going to be, is that an isolated incident, or is that now something that we can see as behaviors for the rest of the industry? And I think that you will see in the way in which the airline industry is not really sure about how to deal with activism. They look at it and they say, we'll pay lip service to it, we'll invite them to our shareholders' meetings, we'll have conversations with them, but our behavior stays the same. And so I think there has to be another Southwest type incident, another Southwest type scenario evolve for the airline to really start paying attention to how activism can work.
Anybody wants to respond to this question? All right.
Hi, this is not a question, this is just like a comment. I'm Victoria from the Institute as well. And I would just like to highlight the human factor and how it is important in safety. And I believe that I'm gonna be rooting for you, Air Canada. So I believe that pressure, like making this pressure to airlines in the end is gonna result in an accident. Why? Because you're not seeing the whole picture. And if the company is like, oh, you need to be on time, or you need to pay millions of dollars because they are being delayed and so on and so forth, that is going to be making pressures on the crew. And in the end, that's going to cause an accident because it is a chain of events. And by you making this pressure of, no, you need to be on time, you need to be on time, that's what it's going to result in the end. So I'm going to give an example. In Mexico, we have an airline called Aeromexico. And I believe like 10 years ago, more or less, they had this slogan that was, "We are always on time." Obviously, that led to accidents, and that slogan is gone. So we cannot be that strict. It is just not numbers, because even if we're talking about airplanes, people are flying those airplanes. So important to think that it's not just maths.
If I may, just to complement, there is a case. It's not connected to passengers' rights regulation, but in Spain, the Madrid-Barajas accident involving Spanair. It was a managerial decision to speed up the process of taking off because they would lose the slot and it would have some cost. And we have clear example there. But how the pressure of the cost could have impact on safety, and all the passengers died in there. So that was a good point. And the only thing I wanted to add as well, just to make it now tradition, is that we are talking about passengers' rights, but we don't have to forget that the first fundamental passengers' right. And when I'm putting my children in an aircraft, I want them to arrive safe and sound. So it's also arriving. And this is something that we should not lose from sight. Because regarding some passengers' issues, I remember actually being in Madrid, being informed that there was a problem with the landing gear of the aircraft. Everybody was scandalized because the flight was 5 hours late, delayed. I was super happy. I was telling everybody, I prefer them to change it, to repair it. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
Well, I think I have also some. Yes, go on. I mean, I find that this idea about safety is a kind of fear-mongering driven by airlines' profit. Not because safety is not important, but because I cannot imagine a pilot with the right mind would agree to take off with a plane which is not perfectly safe. I don't believe there is any. The European regulations have been in place for now. 20 years that it was enacted, 18 years in place. I don't believe there is any scintilla of evidence that any accident ever happened because of financial pressure related to the European regulations. So that's simply an unsubstantiated claim. The fact is there's no evidence. I also, coming back to the point of human rights, certainly I cannot see respecting human rights on board planes somehow leading to safety concerns. And as Vincent here was referring to international law issues, I believe he may have overlooked the Vienna Convention, which is an international law has to be looked at together, not just the Montreal Convention alone, not just one convention. And I think we're on the same page that all international law points have to be taken into consideration. But the Montreal Convention is not a standalone convention. It has to be interpreted also in the context of the CERD. And I'm sure you're aware there is a decision from the UN Committee on Elimination of Racism, which confirms that it's a violation of the treaty to prevent having an effective remedy, including monetary damages. So I appreciate being lectured on being from mathematics, but perhaps you may also want to look at more depth of this matters and look at international law aspects.
Thank you very much for lecturing me on the Vienna Convention on the law of treaties that I've been teaching for like 15 years.
It doesn't show.
Well, go and read Article 31, okay. But whatever. Wow.
We have more questions.
And we have better things to do than hearing that kind of comments.
So one quick question is, you have mentioned so I'm Sébastien, I'm a faculty member here at McGill. You've mentioned multiple times that over the past 3 years we've switched to more of an equilibrium where now it's much easier to submit a complaint for a small delay or all kinds of items. We've monetized in a ways a lot of issues that before perhaps we hadn't, which resulted in a large number of complaints being processed. There's a hidden cost that you haven't mentioned, which is, well, this feeds its way back into airplane prices, right? Airplanes have to recoup their cost ultimately. And so is that ultimately the equilibrium we want? In terms of having a wide number of monetizing every single issue, but ultimately passing back the cost to the customers when they purchase their flight tickets?
Yeah, one of the things that you've seen recently, over and above these compensation claims that are made to the passengers, the Canadian Transportation Agency and Transport Canada has decided in the last 60 days to basically start charging the airline $790 for every complaint that they handle. So over and above the compensation claim that would be payable to the passenger, if the CTA finds in favor of the passenger, there's a $790 charge that the airline has to pay.
It's the consultation, John, actually. It hasn't happened yet.
I know, but
it's Parliament that did it last year.
I know, but it's still process. It's still there as an overhang on this process. It's not there, but the threat is there. And the question would be one of saying, what does that do to low-cost carriers? What does that do to the Flairs of this world, even to the Porter Airlines of this world that operate locally? That to me, is overreach. Over and above the compensation claims that are being made, there is also an administrative charge that I'm not sure where the numbers come from, but that tells me that now we've gone from the sublime, maybe to the ridiculous.
I can answer that question, actually. So I mean, I'm halfway agreeing with John, because one of the submissions we made just last week, November 4th, 2 weeks ago, was that just charging $790 even when a complaint is being dismissed and entirely meritless is completely ludicrous. It punishes even well-behaving airlines. At the same time, if an airline does generate complaints that are upheld, that means that the airline did not comply with the legal obligations, there's no reason why taxpayers should be footing the bill, which is quite hefty bill, for adjudicating those complaints. So our proposal, actually, which we made very detailed economic calculations on our website, is that if a complaint is upheld, the charge should be about $1,900, because that's actually the cost of handling complaints. Part of the reason is that the APPR is way more complicated than the European regulations. The European regulations are simple, APPR are complicated, so way more cost is needed to handle these complaints. But only those airlines should be paying that $1,900 that have complaints which are upheld against the airline. If a complaint is thrown out, not even a cent should be paid. That's our position. So I'm guess agreeing with John overall.
Finally.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, good morning. My name is Safo. I'm with the Institute of Air and Space. My question is to Prof. Correa, because I think Mr. Luca made a very good point, and we would not want to leave him with that perception, where he said that when it comes to matters of discrimination, when it comes to sex, disability, there seems to be this blank check given to air carriers, because discrimination can go on whilst you're in the process of embarkation and disembarkation. But because of the exclusivity which exists within the Montreal Convention, they seem to, for lack of a better word, get away with it. Firstly, the question is, to what extent do you believe this is true? That is, air carriers get away with discrimination and stuff like that due to uniformity and the Montreal Convention and exclusivity. And secondly, if that submission or suggestion he gave is true, do you think that it's just more than saying, well, the Montreal Convention is not perfect and the principle of uniformity? If we take the legal cap off and then think about it as humanly, do you believe that he does have a point if the first premise is true? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Some things actually that I should have said before. There have been some cases, I'm having in mind here some cases in the US, unfortunately I don't have there, but some cases in the US where airlines have been found guilty of practicing discrimination, most notably after 9/11. But it was not on the basis of Montreal Convention, it was more on the basis of the 1963 Tokyo Convention, which is giving the captain in command a lot of powers. And then after 9/11, there were some sort of paranoia that easily understandable, and some cabin crew were afraid when they saw some passengers speaking Arabic. They thought they were maybe plotting something else. But I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. It happens. It happens. And there are some cases where it has been brought successfully to court. The point I made regarding the exclusivity is that if you take the broader perspective, if we want to have international agreement, we have to find ways to make them evolve without circumventing them. So I was saying this is true actually, that if you take the Montreal, all the instruments, and even if you take ICAO and the annexes, when you look at passengers with reduced mobility, when you look at discrimination, there is not so much. in there. So we could say this, but my point was to say it's not by distorting or trying to circumvent the existing legal rules. Then the very last point, the problem is there is that once the doors of the aircraft are closed, it's very difficult to administer some elements that are very crucial, and it's also going beyond this problem here or there. It's how do you administer proof of a discrimination? How do you administer the evidence? And so on. And then it's a closed environment, and the international conventions made in name of security give a lot of powers to the here I'm talking about discrimination on board aircraft. And there have been some cases there. Then the discrimination regarding being bumped or not, the rule of the normal standard process, the way you have to administer claims, normally you have to be able to have different, administering the proofs is very difficult to prove. If I am bumped on an Air France flight, I will maybe not perceive it as being discrimination. If I am bumped on another, and then this has been, and I've seen in Europe, at least in France, some cases like this, and every time it was settled out of court. So, and then beyond, I'm sorry, I have to confess that I cannot go beyond your question.
One comment I would actually ask, I would like to ask Vincent a question. In those cases you mentioned from the US that you refers to, and this were there's international flights, that's question number one. And question number two, were there any monetary damages awarded in those cases? If you could just give me those, because I would love to see them. I'm very interested.
No, I will find them.
Because in Canada, unfortunately, I mean, I would love it to happen in Canada too. In Canada, the last word is, I'm sure you're familiar with the Zogby decision, 2024 FCA 123, paragraph 63 is the key.
I'm just going to be taking the mic out of the stand, if that's okay. Does anybody know how to do that? Okay, I'll just try to do it on my own. My name is Rain, and I'm going to be interpreting for the president and founder of a startup company called AbleFly, Sandra Gualtieri.
Hello. I again I'm not working.
Hello, I agree that the rules and regulations are not working.
Check it. Has to change.
And something has to change.
Yeah, change it for people with disabilities.
EPPR?
Yeah, PTR.
The APTRs for people with disabilities.
They done 4 years ago.
They were redone 4 years ago.
I was part of that.
And I was part of that.
But nothing has changed.
But nothing has changed.
And getting worse.
And it's actually getting worse.
Yeah. I don't know. I'll be begging on you. But American Airlines.
I don't know if everybody knows this, but American Airlines.
Just fine. $50 million for not comply with disability rights.
Plural?
Yeah.
But some American Airlines were just fined $15 million for not complying with disability rights.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, I'm very, very sorry to hear about these experiences, and I guess these issues have been around for a long time. Just that now, thanks to smartphones, we see more of it in our living rooms, but it is not new. One thing I would like to mention that I'm finding nothing short of appalling when it comes to disability rights relates to the government's failure to extend the one person, one fare rule to international travel. Again, citing some bogus international law arguments, which especially in light of the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in IATA, which clarifies that Canada never signed away its right to protect its own consumers when they travel internationally, it demonstrates the airlines were always not making sense on that point. So one person, one fare rule is a simple rule that if a person with disabilities needs two seats for a service dog or an attendant or any reason, the airline cannot charge them more than one fare for that travel. For domestic travel within Canada, that has been first a regulatory policy imposed by the Canadian Transportation Agency around 2008, and then it was incorporated in the ATPDR mentioned before in regulations around 2018-19, I forget the exact year. But there was a caveat carving out international flights. An airline and the government's official line was essentially parroting what airlines were saying, that somehow international law prevents Canada from doing that. That has absolutely no basis. It holds no water. It is mere politics overriding even the most basic human rights and human dignity of persons with disabilities. I would hope that those who are here and who are hearing about it from people with their lived experience, what it means to be a person with disabilities traveling, perhaps will be able to help in having things changed.
Yeah, and I think, the question about, how the airlines provide service to people with disabilities is something that should be, top of the agenda as far as I'm concerned when it comes to Transport Canada's review of regulatory authority and oversight. I know that the airline industry has paid, let's call it lip service so far to making administrative and process changes to in fact address shortcomings in disability passenger handling. The question is training. The question is equipment. The question is investment. And how do you in fact look at oversight of airline investment in the process of handling passengers with disabilities? And I think that's something that we as Canadians should be concerned about in terms of we don't see that oversight being put in place in the market. It's really left to the airlines to decide how they implement those practices.
And in 1 second, if I may add, now I agree with everything that has been said. I agree with everything that has been said. The only thing I would like to add as well is that it's a chain. It's a chain, so it's not only on the airlines, it's also on the airports. I would say as well, when you travel on the subway in Montreal, you see that the accessibility is not so easy. So it's a chain, and it goes as far as including it in the design process of the aircraft, and there it's everything is connected afterwards to the question of costs. So we are facing here, and it's maybe also making a link with the next session, I would say. The fact that the aviation industry at the same time has a lot of cost, because here we have the cost passengers' rights. And I'm not saying that because the persons with reduced mobility, this should not be factored in as a cost. It's human rights, and this I agree. But at the same time, they should invest in order to make things better. And it's exactly the same problem as with environmental protection. That additional cost in order to comply with the environmental standards, but at the same time, the need to invest with limited revenues derived from this. But,
Do you have a final word, AJ, that you'd like to say?
I'm good.
Because
Let's do it.
Yes. We have to wrap up because we have other panels. I mean, I want to thank our panelists for bringing all these different insights that show us that we have made regulatory advances, and we have a lot of regulatory resources at hand, but there's still a lot more that needs to be done, definitely. We also, I think, hear that when we bring these ethical issues at the center, in the airline industry, there are many advances in terms of quality, in terms of competitiveness, in terms of the services that are provided, in terms of doing better what the industry as a whole, with all of these different aspects from design, manufacturing, all the way to the service, it's really important. Ultimately, I think what we hear also is that people are here at the center in everything where we look at it, from the companies or from the consumers, from the regulators. And we are the ones who are devising the rules, and we are the ones who are implementing these rules. We are the ones who are enacting these rules. And I think that what we hear also is that even when we make advances on one side, like on the regulatory side, these shifts, these transitions, the practices, bringing it to practice is really where the challenge is. So I hear where the investments that are going to be made, whether it's in training, in redesigning, in structuring how the things are done. And ultimately, I think what I appreciate very much from our panelists is that we've had people who are speaking from the civic perspective. I think definitely that side is really important. How do we bring the consumer perspective or other civic organizations? We don't have somebody from the government necessarily here, but certainly people who are working on the regulation side, where certainly the government is important, and also in the audience, people from the company. So I think that ultimately, how do these different organizations from all these different sectors, given this interconnectedness, interdependence, and given all the different aspects of the industry, super important to move this, and I appreciate very much all of your insights. So let's thank our panelists, and we have more to come. So.